so it doesn't actually project my voice. I just have to hold it. Okay, welcome to the Community Engagement Series for EPICS. I am Carrie Grant. I'm the Graduate Assistant for Service Learning at Purdue, and I'm presenting today with Amy Wood, who is the Director of Volunteer Engagement at the United Way of Greater Lafayette. Grab a flyer. Okay, and today we are talking about how to self-assess when participating in community engagement projects. So, our learning outcomes for today are going to be for you to be able to identify the role of self-assessment in examining your positionality, right? Your position in the world and how different identities shape that. To define ways to self-assess throughout your community engagement projects. As you guys are doing these very independently, it's important to have that self-assessment in mind. And then to discuss ways that we can address positionality as you're working with community partners. So why self-assess? In community engagement, as you're approaching community engagement projects, it's important to start with an understanding of who you are and where you are coming from and how that lens shapes how you are approaching the design process, right? So if I'm designing things as a young white woman, that may be a different perspective than a black working mom, right? I'm going to have different experiences that are going to shape how I'm approaching what I'm looking for in a design, what I think of first, right? How much money I have also shapes my previous experiences, and that also is going to then be reflected in what my instincts are when I think about designing something. So to start here, we are going to do this activity that you guys have in front of you of two different questionnaires that are going to help you reflect on your social dominance orientation and your global belief in a just world. So go ahead and take a few minutes to complete those scales, and then you're going to discuss them with your peers. that individually. We want you to slide into groups and discuss with a few people how you went about answering these questions. So, how did you arrive at your answers? What did you discover about yourself and who you are, where you're coming from, right? What kinds of experiences have you had that you think are shaping how you are answering these questions on these models? How does this challenge your thinking as an individual about group belonging, privilege, and power? And how might this impact the lens from which you're designing, right? And we want each group to kind of report back one thing from their discussion. So go ahead and get together and talk about how did you answer these things? What do you think is influencing how you answered those things? I know I wanted to take it. Oh man, you're way more distributed. I'm all sevens and ones. Are you? Yep. But I think that is it's a political. Yes, it is. Yep. conversation seems to be dying down. Do we have takeaways we want to share with the group? Make sure you've got something you know you want to share. You do? All right. Cool. So, from this group, what's something you guys discussed that you wanted to share? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Did anyone else notice that was kind of a difference between the two scales? Did you find you had different answers between the two scales based on that? Someone want to share how they answered with those? Okay, let's just hear from another group. What did you guys take away? Mm-hmm. Okay. So how did that show up in your answers? Like, what was an example that? Yeah. Right. Yeah. So your own experiences, maybe, when you say a person's efforts are noticed and rewarded, right? You can think of that in terms of your own experience. Have your efforts been noticed and rewarded? But that's different from thinking more broadly to, do you think that happens for everyone, everywhere, right? And that very much depends on your context, right? Yeah. Okay. What did you guys talk about over here? Or I don't know where the group is. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that difficulty of extrapolating. I know I certainly struggled with on the global belief in a just world scale. Like, people earn the rewards and punishments that they get, right? I can think of probably an equal number of people who I think have really worked hard to earn their position as people who I don't think have done that, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so it very much depends on how you read that question and what you immediately think of as it's talking about. Yeah. Um, let's see. Anyone want to talk about, how you feel like your own experience shapes how you answered these things? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, your experiences in your major, what your coursework has focused on. I think certainly political perspectives come into play in how you answer these questions, right? What do you believe in? Yeah. Um, let's hear from a group in the back. Someone back there, tell me what you guys took away. Okay, we'll slide over a group. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So, did we get to talking about how this might impact your design or things you want to think about as you're designing? What do we think about that? Why do these surveys, these scales, as you're going into thinking about design? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, you may be working with folks who answer this questionnaire totally differently from you, right? Or have totally different experiences. So how do you bridge those differences and gaps? Yeah. Okay. So from here we wanna talk about positionality. So what is positionality? It's defined as facets of the self. For example, institutional privilege as well as aspects of social identity are articulated as positions in a multidimensional geography of power relations. So that's a very jargony definition, but we have then some examples here with the next one is the multiple self, race, nationality, age, gender, social and economic status, sexuality, right? So this is gonna be different for each one of you. So for instance, for me, I am certainly a young-ish, anymore, white woman, right? And I grew up, my dad went to a very elite college, but by the time that I was in high school, we were living on food stamps. So I have this complex sort of matrix of how I am positioned in relation to having certainly cultural privileges, but then economically, I had some things that were very difficult, right? And I didn't have someone, for instance, to help guide me through the college application process. So then once I got past it, I turned back and helped my sister figure out how to navigate it because I then had gained that cultural capital, right? So all of your personal background and experiences are shaping this positionality and how you are positioned in this sort of geography of power relations where in some ways you may be privileged and in other ways you're less privileged. So how do you know when you are or are not privileged? It's a tricky question, but I actually want some folks to take a stab at it. What does that mean? I'll give you a sec to talk about it with your groups and then I'll ask you again. Yeah. How do you think about privilege and your positionality? What do you guys think?
It's just like such a broad question. It's kind of hard to narrow it down. So,
Well, think about it for yourself then.
I don't know. We were talking about just like if there's a problem with something that you didn't even think of before, then that means you were privileged enough to never have to even deal with it.
Right. Yeah, there's all the, what was it with the iPhone unlocking recently that a bunch of Asian women were able to unlock each other's phones? That's probably a problem in the design phase, right? Is that yeah, we weren't really considering diverse spaces. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's talk about it. How do you know when you are not privileged, or what are some examples we can look at here in relation to privilege? Yeah, tell us.
So we talked about it being relative, relational, and
Sure.
how you react to maybe world events or certain situations. The
Mhm.
example I used was police brutality against African Americans
Yeah.
and the Black Lives Movement. You may be able to look at it and say, "Oh, that's a bad thing," but if you don't feel the same emotions or truly understand, like the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
And to come from a place where you understand why there's like violence and arrest and all these things.
Yeah.
When you can't feel those same emotions, then maybe you can say, "Oh, I'm privileged that I don't feel the heat of the emotional charged battles that they're fighting," and
Yeah.
to feel, I guess, blessed that this isn't a problem you're facing.
Yeah, there's a big gap in positionality, right, between police officers and low-income Black communities that are trying to, that's certainly a gap that has not been bridged very effectively thus far, right, in understanding and positionality. Yeah, totally. What are some other things folks talked about in relation to privilege? Yeah. Right. Yeah, the difference between big overarching institutional systems versus individual actions, right, is how we can look at privilege as not based on what you individually did, but what identities make things easier for particular things to happen. I was just listening to NPR today, talked about how in disaster relief, middle-class white people actually wind up with more benefits than poor people, and it's some complicated model based on like risk of like buying out homes that were owned previously, and so if you never owned a home, you're not eligible for that assistance. Anyway, so there's all this whole complicated government system that leads to that outcome that isn't about individual action at all. How about how this might come into design? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, did anyone hear recently about, I think it was the iPhone, right? The face lock technology that Asian women were able to unlock each other's phones? How did that happen? It must have happened at some point in the design process that they didn't catch it before it was released. So were they not testing enough on diverse enough users? It makes you wonder how many Asian designers were part of the design team to think about that initially? Yeah. Yeah.
I work on the ISDBI team, which works for the Indiana School for the Blind and Visually Impaired.
Right.
So people who are blind or have visual impairments obviously approach something very differently than
Yes.
those of us who can see.
Yeah. So what are your strategies then for bridging that gap in positionality?
A lot of student feedback.
Yeah.
Just going down and visiting the school and saying, here's the project. How do you guys approach like the initial use of it? What are some things that feel good? What are some things that we can maybe change? Some things that are inconvenient for the
Right.
way they use the product.
Yeah.
That we wouldn't want to make.
Totally. That's great. Awesome. Okay. So this leads us nicely into thinking about ways to self-assess. So we have the whole design process, right, which is iterative. You identify your problem, your constraints, you're brainstorming, you're generating ideas, you're prototyping and then seeking feedback, refining your design, and it circles over and over, right? So when we're thinking about self-assessing with positionality, we have self-evaluation, which we're doing right now, but then that also leads into discussion, community partner and student assessment, and reflection. So basically, we're asking you guys to think about where positionality and reflection on this positionality can fit into your design process as you are cycling through it, right, in multiple phases. So for here, I'll hand off to Amy.
Hello. So as we're thinking of this, so I'm coming from United Way. I work a lot with the community, obviously, and within nonprofits. So, and which a lot of you will be working within that world. So you said you're talking about the blind school type of projects that you're going to be doing, working with. So so I want to take some time about discussing. Right, there you go. Okay. discussing the how your positionality fits into and why you should be considering this into your design phases as you're going through the circle that we had up before. So tell me, I kind of want to go on a couple of your things that you were pointing out. So the like with the blind school, so you said you had one way to look at that is to be able to interact with them individually, you know, asking lots of questions. So you're already integrating in there. What could have happened had you just come out and designed something that you felt was going to be something that they could use, that was just brilliant, this brilliant idea that was going to make their life better? What do you think could have happened?
Definitely a lot of things. One of the big things for students with strong visual impairments is high contrast. And so if we had some sort of screen on there that they'd still be able to see, but if it was very low contrast, then it's completely useless. If there's not like audio feedback we've implemented into our system, that wasn't there initially. Especially for students who are blind, audio feedback's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also thought about it one thing when you were mentioning yours. Has anybody ever gone up to an ATM machine and they have the Braille on there, and it's a drive-up ATM machine? I always wondered about that. I always thought, how is the blind driving up that they're going to feel the Braille part? So maybe that design, you know, and obviously you can walk up to them, but usually they're drive-up machines. So something like that, you know, that we think, oh, we're going to make this better for them in doing that, but without finding out our positionality of and having our understanding without taking in consideration of their positionality and understanding, can lead us down the wrong hole and definitely not come up with a good design project in the end. So on thinking of interacting with community, this is a part that I'm most involved with. So how do you think, someone tell me how your positionality and your, from what you come from, might compare to some of the people you work with in the community working on their projects?